By 7 that morning, 3 trucks had already slowed down on County Road 14 to watch Margaret Hale plow under the best stand of clover her farm had produced in years. The 22-acre field was thick, green, and ready to become hay, feed, or badly needed money. Instead, the 56-year-old widow lowered the plow and began burying it beneath the soil. Neighbors said grief had finally clouded her judgment and warned that she was destroying the last valuable crop she had left. But Margaret had noticed the first white blossoms opening among the leaves, exactly as her late husband had once taught her to watch for. Months later, those same neighbors finally understood that she had never destroyed the harvest. She had invested it in the crop that would come next. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, would you have sold the clover for immediate cash or trusted what Margaret's husband had taught her? And subscribe for more stories about farmers who recognize value where others see only waste. By 7 that morning, 3 trucks had slowed down on County Road 14. Not because there had been an accident, because Margaret Hale was plowing under the best stand of clover anyone had seen on her farm in years. The field rolled green beneath the June sun, thick enough to hide the soil between the rows. Along the fence line, the first pale blossoms had begun opening above the leaves. To anyone driving past, it looked ready to become something useful: hay, feed, money. And Margaret needed all three. Instead, the 56-year-old widow sat behind the wheel of her husband's faded red tractor and lowered the plow. The first pass cut straight through the clover. Green disappeared beneath brown earth. At the neighboring field, Earl Bennett stopped beside his pickup and stared. "Margaret!" She kept driving. He climbed onto the roadside bank and waved both arms. "Margaret, what in God's name are you doing?" The tractor reached the end of the field and turned. Margaret finally stopped. The engine coughed into silence. Earl crossed the ditch, his boots sinking into the freshly disturbed soil. "You know what hay is bringing this year?" Margaret looked toward the unplowed half of the field. "I know. You could cut this next week." "I know." Earl stared at her. "Then why are you burying it?" Margaret didn't answer. She stepped down from the tractor and walked several yards into the standing clover. Then she crouched. For a moment, Earl probably thought she was checking the soil. She wasn't. Margaret reached between the leaves and carefully lifted a single stem. At its top was a small white clover blossom, not fully opened yet. She turned it between her fingers. Something changed in her face. Not happiness exactly, recognition. 28 years earlier, her husband Thomas had shown her a flower just like it. She could still remember the dirt beneath his fingernails and the sentence she'd almost forgotten. Margaret stood. Earl was still waiting for an explanation. Instead, she climbed back onto the tractor. "That's it?" he called. "You're just going to plow the whole thing under?" Margaret started the engine. "Yes." By noon, almost nothing green remained. Word traveled quickly. Some said grief had finally caught up with her. Others said Thomas had always filled her head with old-fashioned farming ideas. But Margaret wasn't watching the road. She wasn't watching the neighbors. And she wasn't watching the crop disappear. On the tractor seat beside her lay that single white blossom. Because Margaret hadn't been waiting for the clover to become valuable. She had been waiting for it to bloom. 6 months earlier, Margaret Hale had owned more land than she knew how to save. Not much by county standards. 83 acres, a weathered barn, 2 equipment sheds, and the white farmhouse where she and Thomas had spent nearly 3 decades believing there would always be another spring. Then Thomas died, and suddenly every acre seemed to have a bill attached to it. There were property taxes, diesel, repairs, seed. A tractor payment Thomas had never mentioned because when he was alive there had always been another harvest coming. Margaret sold 12 acres along the southern road before Christmas. In February, she sold the cattle. By March, the livestock barn was empty. She kept Thomas's red tractor. People told her that was sentimental. Maybe it was. But sentiment wasn't the reason she refused to sell the north field. 22 acres of clover stood there by late spring, greener than anything else Margaret owned. Earl Bennett came by one afternoon while she was repairing the fence. "You finally caught a break," he said, nodding toward the field. Margaret followed his eyes. The clover moved in the wind like green water. "Looks that way. You ought to cut every acre." She didn't answer. Earl leaned against the fence post. "I'm serious, Margaret. Don't get clever with this one. Cut it." Bail it. Take the money. He wasn't trying to insult her. That almost made it worse. Everyone had started speaking to Margaret that way after Thomas died, as though widowhood had somehow made complicated decisions too heavy for her to carry. The farm needs cash, Earl continued. I know what the farm needs. Then sell what the land gives you. Margaret looked back toward the clover. Thomas would have laughed at that sentence. Not cruelly. He simply believed a field could give you more than one kind of harvest. That night, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table with 3 unpaid bills and a yellow legal pad. She added the numbers twice. They didn't improve. Cutting the clover would help. Selling it would buy time. Maybe enough to make the next payment. She knew that. Yet before going upstairs, Margaret opened the bottom drawer of Thomas's old desk. Inside were seed receipts, soil notes, rainfall records, and 3 battered notebooks held together with a rubber band. She chose the oldest one. Most of Thomas's handwriting was barely readable. But beside a faded sketch of the north field, he had written 4 words and underlined them twice. Don't miss first bloom. Margaret stared at the sentence for a long time. Then she closed the notebook. The next morning, while her neighbors were calculating what her clover might be worth, Margaret walked into the field and began looking for flowers. Thomas Hale never trusted dates as much as he trusted fields. Margaret had learned that during their first years of marriage. He kept calendars in the kitchen, weather records in the barn, and planting dates written on whatever scrap of paper happened to be nearby. But when the calendar disagreed with the land, Thomas followed the land. One spring, nearly 28 years earlier, Margaret found him kneeling in the north field before breakfast. The clover was wet with dew. Thomas had one knee in the dirt and a handful of plants spread across his palm. You planning to eat those? Margaret asked. Thomas smiled. Come look. I've seen clover before. Not what I'm looking at. She walked over anyway. Thomas separated the stems carefully until he found one with a tiny white bud forming near the top. There. Margaret stared at it. That's what dragged me out here before coffee. That's what we've been waiting for. For what? Thomas stood and brushed the soil from his jeans. Then he said something Margaret would hear again decades later, sitting alone in an empty farmhouse. Don't watch the calendar, Maggie. Watch the flowers. She laughed. Thomas didn't. He looked across the field as if something underneath all that green had just changed. What happens when they flower? He hesitated. You have to know what you're growing the clover for. Hay, sometimes. For the cattle? Sometimes. Margaret frowned. What else would you grow it for? Thomas smiled. The next crop. Before she could ask what that meant, he started walking toward the barn. Margaret followed him. That afternoon, Thomas did something she hadn't expected. He turned part of the clover back into the soil. Margaret remembered standing at the fence watching green plants disappear beneath the plow. She had thought exactly what Earl would think 28 years later. What a waste. But later that summer, Thomas took her back to the same patch. He pushed a shovel into the ground and handed her a clump of dark soil. Remember the clover? Margaret nodded. Remember this ground before it? She did. Thomas broke the clump apart between his fingers. Never judge a crop only by what leaves the field. At the time, Margaret had treated it as another one of her husband's farming sayings. Thomas had dozens of them. Most disappeared from memory. This one didn't. Now, 28 years later, Margaret stood alone in the north field. She moved slowly through the clover, checking plant after plant. No flowers. Not yet. The bills were waiting on her kitchen table. Every extra day mattered. Still, Margaret waited. Then, 3 mornings later, she bent down and saw white between the leaves. One small blossom. Margaret touched it with her fingertips and whispered, Now, Thomas? Margaret didn't start the tractor that morning. One flower wasn't enough. She walked another 20 yards into the field, bending every few steps and searching beneath the leaves. Nothing. At the far end, she found a second white bud. Then a third. By the fence, several more were beginning to open. Margaret stood slowly. For weeks, Earl Bennett had been watching the height of the clover. Margaret had been watching something else. She went back to the farmhouse and opened Thomas's notebook again. Most of the page was filled with numbers she could barely understand anymore. Dates, rainfall, rotations, notes written 20 years apart. But beside the words first bloom, Thomas had drawn a small circle. Under it, he had written, "Don't wait for the field to look ready." Margaret ran her thumb across the faded pencil marks. There was another note farther down. She read it twice. Then she closed the book. At 9 that morning, Earl's truck appeared at the gate. He climbed out carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought I'd catch you before you started cutting." Margaret accepted the cup. "I'm not cutting." Earl looked toward the field. "Tomorrow then?" "No." His smile disappeared. "Margaret." She said nothing. "You've got good clover out there. Best thing this farm has produced since Thomas got sick." "I know. I've got a man who'll bale it for you." "No. You wouldn't even have to pay him until it's sold." Margaret looked toward the first white flowers scattered across the green. Earl followed her eyes. "What are you waiting for?" That question almost made her smile. "Nothing anymore." She handed the coffee back. Then she walked toward the equipment shed. Earl followed. "Margaret, what does that mean?" The doors groaned open. Inside sat Thomas's old red tractor. Behind it was the plow. Earl stopped. For several seconds, he didn't speak. Then he understood what she intended to do. "No." Margaret climbed onto the tractor. "You can't be serious." She turned the key. The engine struggled once before catching. Earl stepped closer. "If this is something Thomas told you to do 20 years ago, things are different now." Margaret looked down at him. Thomas was gone. The cattle were gone. Part of the farm was gone. And the bills on her kitchen table were very real. For one terrible second, she wondered if Earl was right. Then she looked across the field. White blossoms were beginning to appear where yesterday there had been only green. Margaret put the tractor into gear. An hour later, the plow reached the first row. She lowered the blade. The clover folded beneath the steel. And for the first time since Thomas died, Margaret bet the future of the farm on something he had taught her. By sunset, the north field looked ruined. That was the word people used, ruined. 22 acres that had been green that morning were now streaked brown, with torn clover stems disappearing beneath heavy furrows. Margaret parked the tractor beside the barn. Across the road, 2 pickups were waiting. Earl stood beside them with Frank Miller and his son. Frank had farmed 3 miles east of Margaret for 40 years. He looked across the field and shook his head. "You really did it." Margaret climbed down. "Looks that way." Frank kicked at a clump of overturned clover. "My boy would have paid you for this standing." His son nodded. "Could have cut it ourselves." Margaret wiped the dust from her hands. "It wasn't for sale." Frank laughed. Not loudly. That somehow made it sting more. "Everything's for sale when the bank wants its money." Margaret looked at him. Frank's smile faded. He knew he'd gone too far. But he wasn't wrong. By the following morning, everyone seemed to know. At the feed store, 2 men stopped talking when Margaret walked inside. At the register, she heard someone behind her whisper, "Thomas would have never done that." Margaret nearly turned around, nearly. Instead, she paid for what she needed and drove home. That afternoon, another envelope was waiting in the mailbox. Past DUE. She carried it to the kitchen and placed it beside the others. For the first time, the freshly plowed field outside her window didn't look like a plan. It looked like 22 acres of lost money. Margaret opened Thomas's notebook. "Don't miss first bloom." She had followed that instruction. But instructions weren't promises. Thomas had worked different seasons, different soil conditions, different years. And Thomas wasn't there to tell her whether this year was one of the years when the old method wouldn't work. Margaret closed the notebook. Outside, rain began tapping against the kitchen window. Within minutes, it grew heavier. She walked onto the porch. Water darkened the exposed earth. The beautiful clover was gone. No hay. No check. No second chance to cut it. For the first time since lowering the plow, Margaret felt afraid. Not of Earl. Not of Frank. Not even of the bank. She was afraid she had mistaken a memory for a farming decision. Margaret stood there until the rain soaked the steps. Then she noticed something caught against her boot, a small piece of clover. Its white blossom was crushed and muddy. She picked it up and remembered something else Thomas had once told her. The flower was only the signal. The reason was underneath it. The next morning, Margaret carried a shovel into the field. The rain had stopped before dawn. Everything smelled of wet earth and crushed clover. She chose a place where the plow had turned the plants deeply and pushed the shovel into the soil. When she lifted it, green stems hung from the dark clump. Margaret broke it apart with her fingers. And suddenly she was 28 again. Thomas was kneeling beside her in this same field, holding up a clover plant by its roots. "Look closer," he'd said. Margaret had looked. Tiny knots clung to the roots. She'd thought something was wrong with them. "What are those?" Thomas smiled. "That's why I planted it." He explained it simply. Clover belonged to a family of plants that could work with bacteria living in nodules on their roots. Together, they could take nitrogen from the air and bring it into the living system of the plant. Margaret had stared at him. "So it's making fertilizer?" "Not exactly." Thomas never liked shortcuts that made farming sound like magic. "The plant is building something," he said. "The question is what you do with it afterward." If they cut the clover and carried everything away, much of what had grown above the soil left with the harvest. But if the crop was grown for the field itself, then managed at the right time, its residue could be returned to the soil. Their decomposition would begin releasing nutrients held in that plant material for what came next. Thomas had pushed the clover back into the hole. "You see hay," he told her. "I see next season." Standing in the field decades later, Margaret finally understood why that memory had stayed with her. The neighbors weren't foolish for seeing value in the clover. They were right. It could have been cut. It could have been baled. It could have been sold. But Margaret was making a different trade. She had given up the value she could carry away from the fields for value she hoped to keep inside it. She lifted another clump. Half-buried leaves were already pressed against the wet soil. Nothing miraculous had happened. Nothing had been proven. Not yet. The farm could still fail. But for the first time since she lowered the plow, Margaret remembered that Thomas's lesson had never been about blindly trusting an old technique. It had been about understanding what the clover was doing before deciding what it was worth. Margaret stood and looked across the brown field. Everyone else thought her crop was gone. But the crop Thomas had taught her to see was still there. Margaret had remembered the flowers. What she had forgotten was why Thomas watched them. The answer was buried in another notebook. That evening, she carried a cardboard box from his desk to the kitchen table and began sorting through 20 years of field notes. Most meant nothing to her now. Rainfall totals, planting dates, seed varieties they hadn't used in years. Then she found a page marked North Clover. Underneath, Thomas had written, "Too early, not enough growth." A few lines later, "Too late, tougher material. Slower return." And between them, circled twice, "Early bloom." Margaret leaned back. Now she remembered. Thomas had never claimed that flowers performed some miracle. They were a marker. A farmer couldn't see nitrogen moving through a plant, couldn't stand at the fence and watch soil biology working. But a flower could be seen from 10 feet away. Years earlier, Thomas had explained that a legume cover crop changed as it matured. Wait longer and you might gain more growth. But older stems became tougher. The plant's relationship between growth, nitrogen, and decomposition did not remain frozen while the calendar moved forward. Timing mattered. For the way Thomas had used clover in their rotation, the beginning of flowering was his practical signal that the crop had reached the stage he wanted. Not every field, not every season, not every farmer. His field, his rotation, his decision. That distinction mattered to Margaret now. Thomas hadn't left her a superstition. He'd left her an observation. The flowers told him when to stop asking the clover to grow and start asking it to give something back. Margaret closed the notebook. The next afternoon, Earl found her repairing a broken gate. He glanced toward the brown north field. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Margaret kept working. "Go ahead. Why'd you wait for the flowers?" Her hands stopped. So he'd noticed. Margaret looked across the road. "You thought I was waiting too long to cut hay." I did. I wasn't waiting to cut hay. Earl frowned. Then what were you waiting for? Margaret tightened the last bolt and stood. For the clover to finish the job I planted it to do. Earl looked toward the field again. For once, he didn't laugh. But he didn't understand either. Not yet. And Margaret knew better than to explain what the soil itself had not proven. She could tell Earl about roots, about timing, about everything Thomas had taught her. None of it would matter if the next crop failed. So Margaret said nothing more, because the flowers had told her when to make the bet. Now the field would have to tell her whether she'd been right. For the next 10 days, the north field gave Margaret nothing to celebrate. From the road, it looked worse than before. Much worse. The clover that had once covered the ground in green was gone. In its place were rough furrows, broken stems, and patches of bare soil drying beneath the summer sun. Every morning, Margaret walked the same path along the fence. Every morning, she looked for some sign that Thomas had been right. There wasn't one. Not one she could see. Then the weather turned hot. The topsoil hardened in places. The buried clover disappeared beneath the surface. And the field became silent. Earl stopped asking questions. Margaret almost wished he wouldn't. His curiosity had been easier to bear than his pity. On the 11th morning, she found another envelope in the mailbox. She didn't open it outside. She already recognized the return address. At the kitchen table, Margaret slid a finger beneath the seal. The amount due wasn't a surprise. The date was 30 days. She placed the letter beside Thomas's notebook. For a long time, she looked from one to the other. One represented what the farm owed. The other represented what she believed the farm could become. Only one of them contained numbers anyone else would trust. That afternoon, Margaret walked into the north field with a shovel. She pushed it into the ground. The blade struck hard soil. She tried again. Then again. Finally, Margaret dropped the shovel. What if I got it wrong, Thomas? The words sounded foolish the moment they left her mouth. There was no answer. Only wind moving through the weeds along the fence. Thomas had farmed beside her for 28 years. But Thomas had also been wrong before. He had planted too early, waited too long, trusted rain that never came. Farming had never rewarded him simply because he understood the theory. Margaret looked across the empty field. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine Earl had been right. She could have sold the clover. She could have paid part of what she owed. Instead, she'd buried it. And memories didn't pay bills. Margaret picked up the shovel and started toward the house. Then she stopped. Near the lowest part of the field, several feet from where she'd been digging, the soil looked different, darker. She walked toward it. The shovel went in easier this time. Margaret lifted a clump and broke it apart. Inside were pieces of clover stem, softened and beginning to lose their shape. Then something moved between her fingers. A small earthworm twisted through the damp soil. Margaret stared at it. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough to make her dig again. The earthworm disappeared before Margaret could decide what it meant. It slipped between two clumps of soil and was gone. She almost laughed. 22 acres, 30 days before another payment came due, and she was standing in the middle of it feeling encouraged by one worm. Thomas would have warned her not to get sentimental, so Margaret kept digging. She chose 5 places across the field. The high ground was still dry and stubborn. But lower down, where more of the clover had been turned into moist soil, the shovel behaved differently. The earth broke apart more easily. Buried stems had softened. Some were already difficult to recognize. Margaret squeezed a handful of soil, then let it crumble back through her fingers. Something was happening, slowly, quietly, and almost entirely out of sight. For the next week, she returned every morning. She didn't measure success by how green the field looked anymore. There was almost nothing green to see. Instead, she watched what happened after rain. She watched how quickly the surface dried. She dug. She smelled the soil. She compared one part of the field with another. And she wrote everything down, just as Thomas had. Then came the morning she was finally ready to plant. Margaret filled the old planter and drove into the north field. Earl saw her from the road. This time, he didn't shout. He simply parked his truck and walked to the fence. "What are you putting in?" Margaret told him. Earl looked across the bare field. "You think that clover is going to make a difference?" Margaret rested one hand on the steering wheel. "I think we'll find out." That was all she was willing to promise. No miracle, no guarantee, just a test. The first seedlings emerged days later. Margaret walked the rows every evening. At first, they looked ordinary. Then the weather turned dry. A week passed with almost no rain. Across the county, summer fields began losing their deep green. Margaret's did too, but not everywhere at the same rate. She noticed it first in the lower section where she'd found the decomposing clover. The young plants there held on differently. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone driving 60 miles an hour to notice. But Margaret noticed. She knelt between the rows and pushed 2 fingers into the soil. Coolness remained beneath the surface. A truck slowed on the road. Earl stepped out. This time he crossed the ditch without laughing. He crouched beside Margaret and touched the ground. Then he looked toward the neighboring field. Then back at hers. "What did you do here?" Margaret stood. "Nothing you couldn't have done." Earl looked confused. Margaret brushed the soil from her hands. The first proof wasn't hanging from a scale. It wasn't stacked in a barn. And Margaret couldn't take it to the bank. But for the first time, someone else could see it too. By August, Earl wasn't the only one slowing down. Frank Miller stopped first. Then his son. A week later, 2 men from the feed store pulled onto the shoulder and stood beside the fence without saying much at all. The north field wasn't spectacular. That was what made it difficult to dismiss. There were no giant plants, no impossible harvest, no miracle growing from Margaret's soil. There was simply a crop that had held together through a difficult stretch of summer better than many people expected. And Margaret knew better than to give the clover credit for everything. Rainfall varied. Soil varied. Fields varied. Thomas had taught her that too. One good season proved very little, but something else had changed. Margaret's decisions. She had begun thinking about the farm differently. Instead of asking only what she could take from each acre, she started asking what each crop could leave behind. The clover had been the first step, not the miracle. The step. One afternoon, Frank walked into the field carrying a shovel. Margaret saw him from the barn. "You planning to steal my dirt?" Frank didn't smile. "Show me." "Show you what?" "Whatever Earl saw." Margaret took him toward the lower section. She pushed the shovel into the ground and lifted a clump. Then she walked several yards toward the field edge and dug again. "Feel them." Frank broke the first clump apart, then the second. He remained quiet. "So this is why you buried the clover." "Part of why." "You gave up a whole cutting for this?" Margaret looked across the rows. "I didn't give it up." Frank frowned. "I just didn't sell that harvest." That stopped him. Months earlier, Frank had measured the clover in bales. Margaret had measured it by what remained in the system. Plant material, roots, nutrients that could cycle forward. And over time, the possibility of building soil rather than treating every season as a separate transaction. Frank dropped the soil from his hands. "My fertilizer bill nearly doubled 2 years ago." Margaret nodded. "So did ours." "And you think this replaces fertilizer?" "No." Her answer came quickly. "I think it can change how much I have to depend on buying everything the field needs." Frank looked at her differently then. Not convinced, but listening. That autumn, Margaret recorded the harvest in Thomas's old notebook. She didn't circle the yield. Instead, beneath his faded words, "Don't miss first bloom," she wrote a new line. "Next year, 25 acres." Earl read it over her shoulder. "You're doing it again?" Margaret closed the notebook. "No." She looked toward the field. "This time I know why." And that was when the laughter finally began to disappear. The following spring, Earl Bennett planted clover. Only 6 acres. He didn't tell Margaret. He didn't need to. She saw it from the road. By May, the field had filled in green, and Earl started doing something Margaret recognized immediately. Every morning he walked the rows. He wasn't measuring the height. He was looking for flowers. One afternoon, Margaret found him crouched near the fence with a clover stem between his fingers. A small white blossom had just begun to open. Earl looked up. "Is this what you were waiting for?" Margaret smiled. "Depends. On what? What are you growing it for?" Earl laughed quietly. Months earlier, he would have answered without hesitation, "Hey, feed money." Now he looked down at the flower. The next crop. Margaret said nothing. She didn't have to. By then, people had stopped talking about the widow who buried a perfectly good field. Instead, they asked different questions. How long had Thomas used clover? Why had he watched the first bloom? Did Margaret turn under every field? Could it reduce what a farmer needed to bring in from outside? Margaret answered carefully. Sometimes she said yes. Often she said, "It depends." And more than once she said, "Thomas tried that and it didn't work." That surprised them most. There had never been a secret formula. No trick hidden in Thomas's notebook. What he'd left behind was a way of thinking. Watch the crop. Watch the soil. Understand what you're asking the field to do before deciding what the harvest is worth. One evening, Frank Miller stopped at Margaret's gate. He leaned against his truck and looked toward the north field. "I owe you an apology." Margaret shook her head. "No, you don't." I laughed. "So did I." Frank frowned. "When?" "The first time Thomas plowed clover under." Frank stared at her. Then Margaret laughed. After a moment, he did too. Before leaving, Frank asked one final question. "So when you buried all that clover last year, you knew this was going to happen?" Margaret looked toward the field. "No." That wasn't the answer he expected. "I knew what Thomas had taught me. I knew what the clover could do under the right conditions." She paused. "Farming decides the rest." Frank nodded slowly. After his truck disappeared, Margaret noticed something beside the fence. She bent down. The first white clover blossom of the season had opened. Margaret turned it gently between her fingers. A year earlier, that flower had looked like the moment she threw away her last good crop. Now, everyone understood. It had never been the end of a harvest. It was the beginning of the next one. That fall, Margaret finally cleaned out Thomas's desk. She had avoided it for almost 2 years. There were receipts that no longer mattered. Seed catalogs from companies that no longer existed. A broken pocket knife. 3 pencils sharpened down so short she couldn't imagine why he'd kept them. And beneath everything else, his notebooks. Margaret carried them to the kitchen table. For months, she'd treated those pages almost like instructions. Something Thomas had left behind to tell her what to do when he was no longer there to answer. But reading them now, she noticed something she'd missed. Thomas crossed things out. A lot. Beside one planting date, he'd written, "Too early." On another page, "Didn't work. Try again." One clover experiment ended with 2 words, "Bad idea." Margaret laughed. Thomas hadn't left her answers. He had left her questions. What is the soil doing? What is the weather telling you? What are you taking from the field? What are you giving back? And perhaps most important, are you actually looking? Margaret closed the final notebook. Through the kitchen window, the north field stretched toward the road. It was still the same 22 acres. The mortgage hadn't disappeared. Diesel wasn't cheaper. Rain still came when it wanted. Nothing about farming had suddenly become easy. But Margaret no longer felt as though she were trying to preserve Thomas's farm exactly as he'd left it. That would have been impossible. She was learning to continue the conversation he'd started with the land. The following spring, Margaret planted clover again. One morning, she walked the field just after sunrise. Dew covered her boots. Near the middle of the field, she stopped. A white blossom had opened among the leaves. Then another. Margaret crouched and touched one gently. For a moment, she could almost see Thomas beside her again. Dirt beneath his fingernails. That crooked smile. "Don't watch the calendar, Maggie. Watch the flowers." She smiled. "I am." Then Margaret stood and continued walking. At the road, Earl's truck slowed. He lifted a hand. Margaret waved back. Neither of them needed to explain the flowers anymore. Because Thomas Hale's real inheritance had never been the tractor. It wasn't the barn. It wasn't even the land. It was knowing that a field could be harvested in more than one way. Sometimes the value was what you carried away. Sometimes it was what you had the patience to leave behind. And sometimes the wisest thing a farmer could do was bury something valuable today so the soil could return it tomorrow. If Margaret's story reminded you that not every harvest is measured by what leaves the field, share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have trusted Thomas's old notebooks and buried a crop you desperately needed to sell? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories about hardworking farmers, forgotten wisdom, and unexpected transformations. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most valuable thing a farmer grows is the future hidden beneath the soil.